Hey, and welcome to a pretty special place today, the erotic garden close to Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand. And I think this is a fun place to show you how to nail the focus on the Fujifilm X-T4. Maybe I should not use the word nail here. So before we start with the actual tips, it's important to choose the right lenses. So let's do that by enjoying this view of this awesome piece of art here. And there are basically three options that you have when it comes to lenses for the Fujifilm X-T4 and X-S10. That's at first that you choose native Fuji lenses, and there it's important to look for the letters LM in the lens name because they stand for linear motors, and linear motors are the motors that are better for autofocus from Fujifilm, at least for video. So that's very important, only choose LM lenses there. Then the second option is Viltrox, or generally third-party lenses, but with a native Fuji X mount. And I mentioned it already, Viltrox is very good there. I tested the 23mm f1.4 and the 85mm f1.8, and they performed really well. And so I also think that the other Viltrox lenses will do the same because they are built very similar to the 23mm lens. And there's also some other lenses, I think from Zeiss and from, I think, Tokino or Tamron. And I didn't test these lenses by myself, so watch some reviews about these lenses if they are good enough, if you want to buy one of those. But generally I think that they also perform well for video autofocus. And the third option you have is to use the Fringer adapter. It's called Fringer EF-FX Pro 2, I think. And I had this adapter with the Sigma 18-35mm f1.8 lens and the Canon EF-S 10-18mm. And I must also say that surprisingly the autofocus on this lenses worked really well. So if you want to use some third-party lenses to have more options, especially the Sigma 18-35 is awesome for this camera, then you can also be safe regarding the autofocus with this adapter. Whew, just had to get rid of my pullover. It's pretty hot here. No, not because of her, because of the sun. Not what you think, guys. And let's start with the first tip here, and this is about the biggest problem actually that people have with the autofocus from the X-T4, and that's that the eye tracking or head tracking in general doesn't always work perfectly. Like when you turn around or something like that, it loses track directly and then it starts hunting. And there's an easy way to solve that, and that is simply that you place the square or the focus point directly where your head is, or perfectly where your head is, and then if it lose track of your face, the focus stays where it is and it doesn't hunt around, so it doesn't look bad even if it loses track of your face. So how I usually do that when I vlog, for example, is that I place the focus point about 2 or 3 steps above the center, because that's where I want to have my face. I don't want to have my face perfectly in the center, but slightly in the top half of the frame, and then I just place my face exactly on the focus point, and yeah, it tracks my face. I have eye tracking etc. on, but in case it loses my face, then it at least stays where it is. What of course sometimes can still happen is that it recognizes some faces in bushes or trees or something like that, and it can still hunt. But to be honest, this is not just a problem on Fuji cameras. I also have that sometimes with the Sony a7S III. So even if there the focus is not perfect, even if it's one of the best systems in the world. So the next tip is not just specific for Fujifilm cameras, that counts for every camera, even on the Sony a7S III. I use that most of the time, and that is that you should shoot in manual focus mode together with the AF on button. So how that works is basically that you're in manual focus, and then when you press the AF on button, it focuses on the subject one time, then it goes back into manual focus when you release the button, and the focus stays where it is, so it doesn't hunt around or do anything that you did not intend to do. And important here when you want to do that is that you set the manual focus not on the lens but on the camera body. So oftentimes you have a manual or autofocus switch on the lens. In that case it has to be on auto on the lens, but on the camera, like for example on the Fujifilm X-T4 here, we have this dial here for manual focus, continuous autofocus and single autofocus, and here I've set it to manual, to M, and then I'm in manual focus on the body, but the lens is set to autofocus. And then everything that you have to do is point the camera at your subject with a tracking point on the subject, of course, and then press the AF on button once and the focus is where you want it to be. And this is how I focus on 95% of my shots. The good thing about it is that it gives me full control over my focus, and it also goes very quick. And the problem is just, even with cameras like the Sonys that have very good autofocus, that when you move your camera, etc., or something comes into your shot, then the camera oftentimes thinks that you want to have something else in focus now, then it changes focus even if you don't want that. And by using the manual autofocus or the manual focus mode with the AF on button, you just never have this problem. Focus stays where it is. The only problem with this is really that when you have a subject that changes its distance to the camera, that it would get out of focus. So in that case, you either would need autofocus, so you can do that on the X-T4 as well. We'll come to that in the next tip. Or what you can simply do is to turn the wheel. That sounds a bit difficult, I know, but it actually is not as difficult as it sounds when you just did it a few times. Like usually when you try the shot for a few times and you turn the wheel to keep the focus locked on the subject, then you will get a shot that works pretty good. What you can do to make it a little bit easier is to simply raise the aperture. So instead of using an aperture of f1.2 or f1.8, you would use an aperture of f4, for example, and then you have a longer range that is in focus, and therefore it's a lot easier to track your subject, because even if you don't pull the wheel perfectly, it's still that the subject is not directly out of focus because the focusing distance is just a lot longer. So that helps a lot if you want to get tracking shots with manual focus. Okay, now it gets a bit creative here. We're having a mix of balls and fruits. That's a good one. And let's talk about the most difficult situation for focusing on the Fujifilm X-T4, I would say. And that's when the subject changes the distance to the camera. And that's, for example, if I would now come closer to the camera, then you want it to track me. Now with a person, that oftentimes works because of face tracking. Sometimes when it loses track of the face, of course that sucks a bit, then you would have to do it again, but usually you can make it work. The only issue is really if you have a non-person, so where it can't track the face, because object tracking is only available on this camera in photo mode but not in video mode. Not sure why that is. Fujifilm, please firmware upgrade if possible. But you can make it work, of course. So you have basically two situations. The first situation is if the subject keeps its position in the frame but it comes closer to the camera, then you can simply put the focus point exactly where the subject is and leave it there. Like I would put the focus point now like in this area here, and then when I come closer it would perfectly track me because the focus point is all the time on me. Where it gets a bit more difficult, the second situation, is when the subject changes the position in the frame. So if I would come closer to the camera now, but at the same time I'm going from the left side of the frame to the right side of the frame, that's a bit more of an issue here. So in that case, the only option you really have, if you can't track the face for whatever reason, maybe the person looks away or it's not a person, it's another object, then the only option you have is to pull the focus wheel manually, which is a bit complicated at the first time, but you get used to that very quick. And to make it a bit easier for you, simply raise the aperture, but you don't always have to have the whole background out of focus. So having an aperture of f4 or f5.6 is totally fine, and it makes it a lot easier to track the subject because the depth of field gets a bit longer. So you have a longer range where the subject is in focus, and therefore if you don't pull the wheel perfectly, it's not that much of an issue because the subject is likely still in focus. So even if you pull the wheel a bit too slow or too fast, you don't directly lose track of the subject. So just increase the aperture a little bit and then try it out by yourself. Just pull the focus wheel and you will see it's actually not as complicated. It also depends a bit on the lens. A lens that I can absolutely recommend to do that is the Sigma 18-35 lens, because the focus wheel there pulls really nicely there. It's really easy for beginners, and this is actually the lens where I learned to do that. So as you can see, focusing on the Fujifilm X-T4 is actually not that much of an issue, as long as you know where its limitations are and how you can work yourself around them. It's actually not that complicated. Most of the time you will shoot in manual with AF on anyway. That's what I do, at least on most of my cameras. And if you want to shoot similar videos to what I do, then it's likely the same for you. So I hope this video was helpful. If yes, then leave me a thumbs up, and also don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell notifications button for upcoming videos. I publish 1 or 2 times times every week. See you in the next video.